Those are all four different areas that can be talked about and explained in a variety of ways, and certainly go into a lot of depth. I think some of the most common physical issues that people come up with would be that kind of correspond with the emotional issues, which would be depression and anxiety, sometimes being over analytical about their life. Those can present a little problem for people. Sometimes a person's definition of success or their belief about what failure means can be a real obstacle to personal growth. And when we talk about life coach, those are probably some things that come up. From a spiritual viewpoint, I think that if you have a value system and your life, the way you live your life or the way you act and behave in your life is incongruent with what you say you believe, that becomes a pretty big obstacle to finding success in terms of your whole life. Well, first we like to help people define what it is that they think are their challenges. And then we look at, in coaching, we look at what are the person's strengths and what are they doing with them. In counseling, we look at what are the weaknesses and how is it influencing and affecting their life, and trying to find some way to find some healing or some internal change in relationship to what they think their weaknesses are. Depends on how they come in, depends on their mood or their focal point, which one they're looking at. So if you're going to try to help somebody find their strengths, it's helping them to identify what their strengths are. So when you help them identify their strengths, then we look at, are you using those strengths in your life? If not, why not, and what can we do to help you make baby steps or take steps to use your strengths?
Okay.
It's a good question. Most people tend to think that they don't have strengths. We, I think humanly speaking, tend to look at our weaknesses before we look at our strengths. Most people that come in here can identify a whole list of weaknesses before they can list a list of strengths for themselves. Oftentimes people take and look at their strengths and then they analyze based upon their behavior whether that's really a strength or not, and decide, well, it's not really the strength, really what it is a weakness because I can't behave that way. A strength really is inherently what genetically you have been given, and spiritually speaking what God has given us, and looking at some of those strengths and identifying them. For instance, I would say that I am really quite stubborn, which creates both a positive and negative. So it's a strength in the fact that being a stubborn person, I believe something and I hold to it. Nobody's going to dissuade me of that. In fact, the more people try to dissuade me, the more I'm probably going to dig my heels in and be stubborn and not give it up. On the other hand, being stubborn sometimes when you're wrong doesn't allow you to change very easily. Stubbornness is both a strength and a weakness. If you consistently use your stubbornness rather than turn to a spiritual value of humility, then you've got a problem. So the strength is a strength unless you know when not to use it.
Inappropriate.
Absolutely. What other? I'm not a very patient person. So when I look at the scripture in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4, it says love is patient. I don't get beyond that one before I start looking at the reality that I'm not a very patient person. Well, patience is a virtue, but being impatient sometimes motivates you because impatience creates an adrenaline energy rush. And so, if I'm impatient, it's not necessarily a sin to be impatient, but if it's how I use that impatience, it's how I use it. If I direct it to create something, then my impatience can motivate me and get me moving. On the other hand, it can also make me irritable and being impatient, not speak very well at times. So, it can become a weakness. If I use it appropriately, it can be a strength.
So what I hear you saying is that our weaknesses are also strengths if used appropriately. In fact, I think that's a very biblical, something we find very strong foundation for in the Bible.
Yes. When Jesus, I believe, talked about in our weakness, he becomes strong.
Correct.
if we can understand what those weaknesses are. I think we have to have a balanced view of ourselves, which is another thing that I think Paul said is, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but don't think the opposite side of that implied is don't think of yourself less than you are. And so it's being able to look at both your strengths and your weaknesses and say, how do I use them? And how effective can I be? We use the 80-20 rule, that we want to be living 80% of our life out of our strengths and 20% of our life working on our weaknesses. We can be so strong that we don't rely upon somebody else, or we don't rely upon God. And in that sense, if we come across too strongly, we can overpower people. I don't know when we talk about being too strong in what term you might want to think about that. Am I being too strong in terms of overpowering my personality? Am I being too strong in the sense that I have no weaknesses? I think that we all have weaknesses, so none of us can be too strong in that sense. I think God calls us to understand our weaknesses and to depend upon Him in our weaknesses, and to ask Him to help us with wisdom and understanding to use our strengths in a healthy way. So, is there such a thing as being too strong? Probably not.